Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. As you know by now, I am a huge fan of the Penguin Classics, and back in November I was browsing the shelves at one of my favorite bookstores, and I came across a novel that had completely escaped me. The Time Regulation Institute by Ahmed Hamdi Tanpınar. The title was interesting, the back cover was intriguing, the book looked good. This is a used copy, okay? And I really have not read a whole lot of Turkish literature, so I did not think twice. I was like, I need to buy this book and read it, because look at this. It has been described here in the back cover as perhaps the greatest Turkish novel of the 20th century. And you know who was a fan of this novel and this author? No, not Jorge Luis Borges, but Orhan Pamuk. So I decided to read this novel. Now I have read it, and I want to share with you my impressions and what it was like, my experience reading this novel. So the Time Regulation Institute was published in 1962. It is roughly 400 pages in length, and the story is divided into 4 parts. The last one very, very brief. It is a novel in the form of a memoir, so as you can imagine by that, the structure and the way of presenting the story is quite free, because with memoirs you can pretty much let memory speak. Our protagonist, as we're going to see, is an anti-hero. And I don't know about you, but when I hear those two words, memoir and anti-hero, the first thing that comes to my mind, the first book that I think about, is Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky. And not only that little novella, which is great in itself, but all of the texts that it inspired throughout history. Now, I want to say there is much of that in the Time Regulation Institute, but there's also much more. So that's the part that I would like to focus on, the much more, because we already know what to expect when we have anti-hero memoirs, but there's more to this text than that. So our protagonist is a certain Hayri Irdal, and he begins the story in a very interesting way. Look at the first sentence right here. First thing he says is, I have never cared much for reading or writing. Anyone who knows me can tell you that. So imagine a memoir that begins that way. Hayri pretty much led a dull, uneventful existence until he became part of the Time Regulation Institute. And it was also thanks to the man who founded this institute, a guy by the name of Halit Ayarche, that Hayri's life basically changed, and he found a purpose in life. So regarding the tone of these memoirs, what you're going to find here is plenty of irony and plenty of sarcasm. Through his observations, and in a completely non-literary way, because he's a person who's not really interested in reading or writing, what Hayri does is to provide a critique of a society that is caught right in the middle between traditional values and modernity. It's a society that is trying to transition. So this is satire. In many moments you're going to find that it is a brutal satire, but as I always say, satire itself, the very mode, no matter how brutal, implies that the author cares about society that he or she is concerned with, whatever it is that he or she happens to be satirizing. So I think that's an important part of satire that we need to emphasize. What is the main theme here? The Time Regulation Institute has been described as an allegory of modernization. The purpose of the institute, of the title, is basically to regulate watches and clocks so that they all have the same time, so that everybody is on the same page, if you want to put it that way. If your clock or your watch does not happen to be at the exact time that it should be, then you are fined, okay? So our hero finds his purpose in life by belonging to this Time Regulation Institute, which is a kind of time police, if you want me to describe it in an interesting way. So because of that, the condemnation of bureaucracy is also a big part of the theme right here, because unfortunately modernity or modernization and bureaucracy often go together, and that is the case in this novel. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the novel just by navigating the different parts into which the story is divided. The first part is titled Great Expectations, just like that great and problematic novel by Charles Dickens. Though I think, when we say Dickens, problematic and Dickens almost go together, but in a wonderful way, because Dickens is an author who managed to be problematic and still survive and stand the test of time. But, as I always say, that's another story and maybe a topic for a different video. But in this first part, when the story begins, what Heidi does is to tell us a little bit about himself, and also a little bit about the Time Regulation Institute, but that happens only very briefly. Immediately after that, Heidi begins to describe a series of very interesting characters. However, I was a bit confused when I was reading this novel, because I kept expecting Heidi to tell me a little bit more about himself and or about the Time Regulation Institute, but instead I was being told about all of these characters. Now, the characters were really colorful, okay? And I asked myself, in a way, couldn't we say that the people around us are also part of ourselves? So maybe in that way he was telling me a little bit more about himself, and that is one way to look at that part of the story. But actually he answered my question or my concerns himself, because on page 51 I read this: "But however I might regret it, I cannot explain myself without looking back. I lived among these men for years, and with them chased after their dreams. There were times when I even dressed like them, adopting aspects of their personalities. Without my quite knowing, I would on occasion even become Nuri Effendi, or Abdus Salam Bey, or yes, even Sayyid Lutfullah. They were my models, the masks I hardly knew to be masks. I would don one personality or another before heading out to mingle with the crowds. And still today, when I look in the mirror, I can see these men reflected in my face." So that is his answer as to why he's telling us about all of these people instead of about himself. Now I'm going to mention one character and one episode from this first part of the novel that really stood out to me. The character is the one that was mentioned in this little passage that I read to you, and that is Sayyid Lutfullah, who is a character who can converse with spirits. And then the event is the resurrection from the dead of Heidi's aunt. Okay, so that is definitely something to look out for there in this first part as a salient character, and also a salient event or a memorable event right there. Part 2 is titled Little Truths, and this is the part that I would say is more traditionally autobiographical. The kind of thing that I was expecting from part 1 actually begins to happen in part 2, because here at the very beginning of part 2, Heidi tells us that at one point he came back from the Great War, and he found himself almost forced to marry a girl who was a maid by the name of Emine. This is his first wife, okay? Now, before we go forward, the Great War, okay, so he's coming back from the Great War. That means that this novel takes place in the 1920s, and this is extremely important, because 1919 and also the early 1920s, and also later on, what you have is the War of Independence in Turkey and the founding of the Turkish Republic. And right after that, you have the whole process of modernization that is being satirized in the novel. So it's really no coincidence, of course, that the events of the novel take place during this time. In this second part, we also meet the character that I take to be the most important one, after, of course, Heidi and Halit Ayarche, the guy who started the Time Regulation Institute. And that third important character to me is Dr. Ramiz. He is a psychoanalyst. The Time Regulation Institute satirizes many things, but one of those things is actually psychoanalysis, which, I mean, to me, if you ask me, that is an ingredient of modernization or modernity. So we have that satire of psychoanalysis. In this second part, we also have a satire of spiritualism and spiritualist societies. But the critique of modernity, I would say you can see it in many things, and even in the details of the characters. For example, in this second part, we hear about the second wife of Heidi. Her name is Pakise, and she is just obsessed with movies. Okay, movies, another element of modernity. What happens to her is that sometimes she mixes up her own life with things that she saw in a movie, so she may think that something actually happened to her, when in fact it was something that she saw in a film. And also related to this, later on we also hear about Heidi's sister-in-law, who wants obsessively to become a singer. Another thing that you could relate with modernity. So you can see that even in the details of the novel we have this criticism and this also exploration, very objective, of what happens when a society tries to transition from tradition to modernity. So we come to the third part titled Toward Dawn. And it is in this part that we hear about Khalid Ayarcha opening the office that will eventually become the Time Regulation Institute. The enterprise really takes off because Khalid is somehow able to convince the mayor of the importance of having everybody on the same time when it comes to their watch or their clock. So Khalid is basically an opportunist. Okay, he is the guy behind the idea. And the novel really shows great insight into the type of society where you have mechanisms of control and repression. To give you an example of that, so in order to give the Institute more momentum, what Khalid and Heidi do is to make up a figure, Ahmed the Timely, and they tell the mayor, look, Ahmed the Timely, we have this historical figure who is a kind of a patron saint for us, and the anniversary of his death is coming up. And this is something that we could celebrate and maybe, promote the Institute that way. Of course, Ahmed the Timely does not really exist. They have created him. But that points to the importance in this type of society where you have control, repression, of creating myths, right? So you create the myth and then you can go from there. On page 286, related to this, what I found is a great and very succinct definition of bureaucracy, because Khalid Ayarcha speaks of an absolute institution, a mechanism that defines its own function. That is, I think, is a great way of defining the Time Regulation Institute of the title, and also societies that are marked by that endless and oppressive bureaucracy. After that, we have part 4, which is very, very short, and it is titled Every Season Has an End. And in this part, the main concern, at least when the last part is starting, is that Heidi is trying to design a building where the Time Regulation Institute is going to be housed, the central part of it, at least. So we hear a little bit about that, and then, as you can imagine, since this is the conclusion of the novel, we hear about what happened to the characters and to the Institute itself eventually. So that is the novel. I just wanted to give you an idea of what it is like, and now I want to share with you my experience reading it. I'm going to say that initially the Time Regulation Institute was really not a smooth read for me. And I feel that what happened to me was that I was misled in a way by the title of the novel and also by the back cover description. Now, being misled by the back cover of a book is something that happens every day all over the world. But what I'm saying is that I think that the title and the back cover description, what happened was that they gave me, or they led me to generate the wrong series of expectations. That's the best way that I can put it. What I was expecting when I read them was some kind of a Kafkaesque description of this imaginary institute, the people who were involved in it, the way that it functioned, all those sorts of things. And something close to that, I really had to read and go to page, I think it was 200, let me check, 236. That's when we actually begin to hear about Khalid Ayarcha opening the office that is going to become the Institute. So I was like, okay, 236, that's where I start to see the kind of thing that I was expecting from the book. Now, this says more about me, probably as a reader, than it does about the novel itself. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to recommend an alternate title for you, just in case this is helpful to you if you decide to read this novel. The title that I would choose for this novel is The Memoirs of Khairi Irdal, Time Regulator. I feel that if I had read that title, I would probably have expected the kind of thing that the novel actually is. But once again, it's my problem. It's really my series of prejudgments that I had based on the title and the back cover description. The good news here is that for good or ill or both, I am always faithful, or almost always faithful, to a book that I begin. Okay, it is very rare that I'm going to stop reading a book and just leave it there. Actually, that would be an interesting video, right? The books that I have stopped reading, because there are not many of them, and those are very, very special cases. But we may look at that in the future. So I kept reading, and eventually I came to accept the novel for what it was and to accept its structure for what it was also. And in the end, looking back on my reading experience, I have to say that I really enjoyed it. I think this is a great novel, and it really deserves to be called one of the most important novels of the 20th century. So the bottom line here is that I would actually recommend this novel to you. Like all great allegories, the Time Regulation Institute is really one of those stories that continue to expand after you have finished reading them. I really love satire and sarcasm. There's plenty of that in this story. And these two things, satire and sarcasm often go together. This is definitely the case here. So I think that another good thing about this book is that it's one of those books that you can read for tone. And I love that. Okay, I will read a book even if nothing happens in the story or the plot or whatever. If the tone is the right tone, then I am just amazed by it, and I enjoy it very much. We are talking about a novel that happens or takes place in 1920s Turkey. So the way that I look at it is this could totally have been a realist story dealing with the very important events that happened during that time in a quite realistic and even literal way. But the author chose to present the zeitgeist in a very complex and a very personal way. And I think that is what makes the Time Regulation Institute quite memorable and worth your time. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those are my 2 cents on the Time Regulation Institute by Ahmed Hamdi Tanpınar. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.